The Maldives is in the clutches of a power-hungry individual. Its totalitarian President Abdullah Yameen, Mr. Yameen, has forced judges of the Supreme Court, the opposition says, at gunpoint to reverse an order which would have seen the opposition return to power and himself ousted. The opposition and the Supreme Court have fervently appealed to India. India has its troops on standby, but New Delhi is unlikely to send them to the island nation. Why? What are the pros and cons of Indian army intervention in the Maldives? Let's take a look. The courts and parliament have been shut down by the army. Demonstrations are subdued because they face army troops, and oppositional politicians have also been arrested. The Indian army won't intervene for several reasons. One, because the situation is essentially a domestic crisis. Second, this is not an act of terrorism, no matter how brazen. Finally, there has been fortunately no bloodshed. If there is, it may change. But for now, the Indian Army will stay in a state of preparedness in southern India. They all benefit from India in one way or another. Their citizens frequently cite Indian conditions to better those in their own countries. And yet, be it in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, Nepal or the Maldives, India bashing remains the #1 pastime in all of India's neighbouring countries. Any Indian boots on the ground in the Maldives would worsen India's reputation in the entire region. Now, that's another reason why Indian Army boots will stay put in India for now. The closeness between Mr. Yameen and Beijing could well be described in a slogan that indicated brotherhood between China and India in the 60s. China has managed to tighten its control over the island nation through its usual brand of debt trap diplomacy as an important hub of its Belt and Road Initiative. More Chinese tourists visit the Maldives every year than the entire population of the island nation, whose primary source of income is tourism. An Indian army intervention in the Maldives could set off a multilateral conflagration which could go out of control. But India has the edge over China in two other ways, neither of which Chinese can do much about. Maldives and Indians share cultural commonalities, as does all of South Asia. The Maldives is part of some ancient volcanic chain as India's Lakshadweep Islands. Indeed, there is only one other part of the world where the Vehi, the language of Maldives, is spoken too. It is in the Minicoy Island in southernmost atoll of India's Lakshadweep. And another aspect that China will never be able to change is India's closeness and its ability to respond in a crisis in the Maldives, which has won New Delhi much goodwill. But in the past, from its southernmost tip, India is merely 700 kilometers away from the Maldives. Joining me live is our senior foreign editor, Padma Rao. Good evening, Padma. India has intervened before. Why is India hesitating now?
Well, the earlier intervention in 1988, Jessica, as you know, was in response to a request raised there by the then President Maumoon Gayoom. And it was specifically to quell a coup attempt, which was initiated by a Maldivian businessman with the help of 19 Tamil terrorists from neighbouring Sri Lanka. This is when the Indians sent in troops and paratroopers, and they managed to quell the coup within hours and, restore normalcy in the Maldives. Now, today's situation is a different situation. You have, who is in control? There's nobody actually in control in Malé who could possibly request the Indian army or the Indian government to send troops in. The only people who are requesting India are in exile, most of them, or they're in jail. They've been jailed by the president. That is the Joint United Opposition in the Maldives. So there is no, technically there is no official request. Having said that, India is very much aware that the judiciary, the highest judicial instance in the Maldives, has made an appeal, a very fervent appeal, and so have the Maldivian, the exile opposition politicians. But you cannot send an army force, a military force in without running the risk of further damaging India's, reputation in the region, which is already, which continues to take a knock as the big brother. So India really has to be very careful in the region, especially with putting boots troops on the ground. Now, the third and last factor is the fact that there is a Chinese presence, which is significantly larger than it was in 1988 when Indian troops first went in. So you obviously want to avoid any sort of an escalation. And, whether fair or unfair, whether the Chinese have any business in the Indian Ocean or business to be in the Indian Ocean or not, they are there and we'll have to deal with that. And that is one of the reasons why I think India would always prefer, as it has before, to go for a diplomatic alternative first. And if all else fails, and if there is an outbreak of violence, or if there is, some sort of bloodshed on the ground, then the Indian armed forces might have a rethink.
Right, and if diplomatic courses don't open up, Padma, are we given to believe that the military build-up in southern India goes in vain?
Well, I think right now it's very unlikely to happen. I think the main thrust is going to be on diplomatic initiatives. And I don't mean diplomats sitting around a table and drinking tea and, making small talk. What I do mean is something very definitive and something much stronger than that. Let's say like sanctions. Let's not forget that the Maldives, despite the Chinese presence and Chinese investment in infrastructure there, the Maldives as an economy are still quite dependent on India for a variety of reasons. Many Maldivian politicians, many top politicians, seek medical treatment in India. I mean, look, it is the closest neighbor. There are only about 700 kilometers between the southern tip of India at Kanyakumari and the northernmost Maldivian atoll. So these are, there is a dependency factor there. And if you cut off that dependency, then when you cut off the supply line, then you may see, a reaction. But right now, I think what we have to do is watch and wait and see what the envoys that Mr. Yamin has sent to his closest allies, China, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, what they come back with and how the situation develops on the ground in Mali.
All right, thank you for joining us on the program, Padma Rao, and giving us those details. Appreciate it.